Greetings, bibliophiles, guests, and anyone else interested in knowing the literary world that surrounds us. Today on Books in the World, we have a real treat for you because we have as our guest Michael C. Keith, who's written in so many fields that I feel quite intimidated even talking to him. But I think what you will find most interesting is that he is an author, a college professor, an expert on radio.
So they say.
So he said. You said. He told me so himself. He told me he was. He told me he was the acknowledged academic expert on radio.
Hoping you believed me.
And he's written in a lot of fields. And so what we want to do is discuss with Michael some of the things that have occurred to him. And how long have you been writing?
I have been writing 40 years.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah,
well,
oh goodness. I started at 2, of course.
He was a child writer. But Michael, thank you and congratulations on your latest book. But you've written how many books?
Well, I put them in categories. I was an academic, am an academic, and had published some 30 volumes in the academic area, and about a dozen years ago shifted over to the fiction area, and I've just completed my 14th manuscript in the fiction area.
Now, doesn't he make us all feel like shirkers after that? And
you haven't read them yet. Wait till you read
Well, that is true. We'll hold judgment on that.
A lot of white space.
One thing I wanted to start by asking you is, Michael has written a number of books of short stories, and we were having a little discussion before we started on short stories. And as a reader, I'm always sort of reluctant to start short stories. So tell our audience why you like short stories and what it offers the reader.
Well, I think short stories provide instant gratification, I guess, in a short attention span world. Short stories have been around hundreds of years, but I think what is a hallmark of short stories is the fact that the writer, if the writer is effective, captures a universe or a world in a pretty concise amount of time. And for me, I like the variety that short stories offer. I like to shift from one genre to the next genre. As a writer, I enjoy the fact that I don't have to spend year upon year writing short stories. Maybe that has more to do with my lack of patience and my own attention deficit or short attention span. But I like shifting from one scenario to another scenario. It keeps me fresh, it keeps me interested, and it keeps me kind of looking ahead for the next possible plot.
You know, it was interesting as we were discussing short stories, and I was inveighing against short stories and telling, and then I realized there was this fellow named Arthur Conan Doyle, who was pretty good at doing short stories, and I did enjoy all his. So, for those of us who are sort of neophytes when it comes to short stories, I did enjoy reading Michael's book on that. And I wanted to ask you. You say you like going from genre to genre and genre in short stories. What particularly fascinates you? What topics particularly fascinate you as you're writing?
Yeah, well, I grew up in the era of Twilight Zone and science fiction theater and the Outer Limits and whatnot. So I was always intrigued with stories like that. And so when I began to sit down to write my own stories, I guess it was just natural that I would flex my new muscles on that kind of writing, and in fact spent quite a bit of time writing in what's known as a speculative fiction area, science fiction, horror, fantasy, and whatnot. Had a lot of fun doing it, and was excited about the imaginative process and the creative process of conceiving stories that took the reader to a lot of different places. But as time went on, I kind of moved into other areas, maybe you could call them more naturalistic, more realistic, and began focusing on more everyday issues and incidents. I do occasionally shift back into the speculative vein and the speculative genre, but more and more I have found a greater comfort zone in trying to convey the strange reality of everyday life, if you will call it that. I'll call it that.
You know, when you think about it, people who watched The Twilight Zone, for example, everyone remembers certain stories that you never forget.
Oh yeah,
Like the one about the pig heads, where they were, you know, I mean, you remember that kind of stuff, and it's really, there's a universality there.
Yeah, I think there really is, and it's a genre that doesn't go out of style. It's still a significant part of pop culture, albeit more in other art forms, like we were talking about cinema and movies. If you look what's at the multiplex, you find that there is a concentration of films that have to do with superheroes, extraterrestrials, and science fiction and the like, which I still have an interest in. I still enjoy it, but maybe it has to do with the fact that I've become more reflexive as time goes by and as I age. I'm finding that the vicissitudes of everyday life are maybe even more strange than speculative fiction is, and so I'm finding it good grist for my mill. From my writer's mill, and so in the last few years, I focused, I think, a little bit more on the naturalistic side of the page than the speculative.
Actually, it seems like real life is almost dystopian these days, right? So
yeah, less utopian and more dystopian.
Yes. What would Thomas More say about that?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
You know what? I was wondering too. Now he has some of the finest universities in the country: Boston College, George Washington, University Marquette. What did you learn most from your students?
Boy, is that a good question. I think I learned most from them is that it's important not to shut them out. It's important not to think, well, I am the ultimate and absolute authority here. I am the dictator, and the only thing worthy of hearing in the classroom is what emanates from my own mouth. And it's really not so, because young people are in touch with things that often defy someone who gets a little longer in the tooth. And just the other day in my Boston College class, I spoke. I had asked them if the next class they'd come in and tell me about what is their preferred medium, what is their preferred genre, what are they spending their time with, their leisure time with, what are they watching, where are they watching it, and it was a revelation. It was very, very interesting where they go for what they're watching, and what they are watching is equally fascinating, because I thought for sure it would be focused on the absolute most recent and the latest things, but they're going back oftentimes when they're looking at Netflix and Hulu and whatnot on old television shows. I say old television shows of our generation and my generation, that they're looking at with fresh eyes because it's new to them. And what's more is they're appreciating some of these old shows that were written exceedingly well and are deserving of a second chance.
So that's a way almost of imparting cultural values. In, that we wouldn't have thought of before. We might have done it through books or something. Speaking of which, we hear that students don't read.
We do hear that.
What's your take on that?
Well, That's true. In college, of course, they have to read, and they have to read what's assigned. So they may be more readers because of that situation than they will be in the future, and that's alarming, and that's a concern, because we hear dire reports that literary fiction is fading away, going by the wayside, and that students are much more oriented to the screen in its various manifestations, and consequently, they're not spending as much time with content that has something, I think, of real value to convey, which I feel that literature, contemporary literature as well as the classics, impart knowledge, also are demanding in the sense that a reader has to bring his or her imagination to the text, has to create the worlds, at least from a visual standpoint, has to imagine the characters, has to imagine the scene, the scenery, and whatnot. So there's much more going on, I think, cognitively, intellectually, by sitting down with a hard copy with a book than there is watching something that's been produced and just dropped in your lap, something that you watch.
Don't you agree, though, that some literary fiction deserves to wither and die? It is so boring that you can imagine that it's pretty tough to inveigle kids to read it when you don't want to read it yourself.
Well, certainly, that's true of any art form.
Now, tell me, did you read The Goldfinch?
I did not.
800-page. Well,
I did not read The Goldfinch.
I've yet to find someone who has actually read the whole thing, right, or admits to it, and yet,
Right.
Big seller literary fiction and all that.
Absolutely. All the accolades, all the awards, and whatnot. I think someday I might get around to it.
Well, I hope it's a time when you
I have a lot of time on my hands, and
if the flu strikes, it'd be perfect
that's the
for
one
you.
to read, right?
Yeah, I think that might be the disconnection between people's reading habits and, because they think, oh my goodness.
Yeah, there's wonderful stuff for the 18 or 20 or 22-year-old to read that is stimulating, that is demanding, that is artistic, and that would be, of benefit intellectually. For young people to read, which unfortunately they may never get to, they may never see.
You see, I went to Catholic school forever, and you didn't have a choice, right?
No.
It was. I remember the summer of Thomas Hardy. It was not a good summer. It was oh God help me. The Russians seemed like Dostoevsky seemed pretty lively after
exciting,
that.
yeah, right.
Well, I think now that doesn't happen as much.
No.
I think people are more eclectic in their taste.
Well, what kind of concerns me is there are a lot of contemporary writers that I know that young people would embrace if they took the time, or if it was assigned, or if they had a chance to read it. But they're not going to see that stuff, and that stuff may turn them on to go deeper. And to go to Thomas Hardy, and to go to Dickens.
No, Thomas Hardy, no.
Well, there's some value in Thomas Hardy, but there's also some stuff that's a little hard to get through. But there's Dickens.
But look at Jane Austen, right?
Yeah, there's Jane Austen.
One of the best books ever written, right?
Right.
And those were popularized.
Oh, sure,
and now
absolutely.
maybe people actually read the books.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, you, we talked a little bit about, you had written a memoir.
I did.
That was well received and might be a screenplay?
It is a screenplay, but it might someday get to the actual screen. There's often a considerable lag time and distance between the screenplay and it actually going to production.
What about this memoir made it connect with people?
Well, let me count the ways, as they say. I think it was a unique story, and it has a universality to it. It had to do with a young boy, a 10, 12-year-old boy, who is kind of dragged around the country with a sociopathic, or I should say, an alcoholic father, and the experience they have over a 12-year period of time hitchhiking America, and the characters they come across and the situations they find themselves into. There's as much humor to it as there is a tugging at the heartstrings.
I saw it compared to On the Road and Kuryak and all these people, and that's pretty
Very
high praise.
flattering, yeah,
Oh, no kidding, pretty high praise.
Very, very flattering. Yeah, it has, I think, been greeted well by people who sit down and read it. It's called The Next Better Place, as a matter of fact.
Do we have it here?
No, we don't.
No, well.
No, we don't. I didn't think to bring it because I thought we were going to talk about more recent publications. But it is available on Amazon, and it is available as a Kindle, and it's available as an audiobook and all those various media.
Most of us don't have interesting enough lives to
write a memoir.
No,
Yeah.
it'd be terribly
Yeah.
boring unless it became fictional memoirs, as we've seen quite a few of those come out.
Yeah. This is very non-fictional. It embraces, I think, as close as one could imagine, actual events.
And that, to me, that's a hard sell when you're trying to get it published, a memoir, right?
It is, unless it's just outrageous.
So yours?
Well, I think I think there's many things about it that would fall into the category of can you believe that actually happened? And it did.
You know what, I also noticed among your writings, and these were mostly academic, but not all, you wrote with a co-writer.
I did. In academic books, yes. My academic books I wrote with a gentleman called Robert Hilliard, who is a brilliant fellow who actually is a fiction writer and a playwright. In fact, he has a book of poetry coming out any moment now. But we wrote, I think, in the area of 22 volumes of books that had to do with all kinds of aspects of the media's relationship with society and culture. And it was a joy to work with him.
So you didn't find it difficult to write with a co-writer?
I've heard stories, nightmarish stories, but with Bob, it was just a pleasure. It was the easiest thing we ever did. There was never in the 15, 18 years that we wrote our books ever a tense moment, never a disagreement. Right from the beginning, we had established a formula. We did what we were supposed to do, and it resulted in books that filled a need in the market. One of our books, Waves of Rancor, was chosen by President Clinton to be one of his official summer reading books, and got a lot of attention in Time magazine and the New York Times and whatnot. It was about the radical right, and we had interviewed people like David Duke, and it was a fascinating experience putting that book together. So to get to your original question about how was it to work with someone, I just lucked out in being partnered with this wonderful, wonderful writer and human being, as a matter of fact.
Now, you said that Mr. Hilliard, he's got poetry coming out. Tell me you don't write poetry as well.
I only do it when I'm foolish, I think. I'm not a poet, but there are times when I'm touched by the muse of verse, and I think as you go back and look at some of my collections, invariably you'll find one or two pieces in there that I've slipped in and managed to avoid scathing condemnation.
Yeah, because poets are pretty tough on other poets.
Yeah, I know too many poets and too many good poets to even try to muscle in on them.
You know, you've written, let's see, memoir. Well, the academic books we talked about, memoirs, short story.
Right.
You had one that was a novel that was all fiction.
I call it a young adult novel. Yeah, did that as well, and I think in the future I'll venture into the novella, give that a try.
Well, you're right there. I mean, if you go between the short story and a novel,
There you go. You've got the novella.
Yeah, you got the
you
novella.
know. I'll take baby steps. I'll do the
Yeah,
novella
I
before
see that. You're a
I do
cautious guy. You go from one to
before
another.
I try to emulate Trollope's Barchester series of 800 pages. I'll stick with the 100-page
Tolstoy did
novella.
1,100 on the first part of War and Peace. So
I'm not going there.
Yeah, you're not going to go there.
No.
You know, but I was thinking though, in when you're writing a novel, a YA novel,
Right.
what did you see as the line of demarcation between, you know, because now they have modern adult, young adult. What did you see as the distinction?
I don't think I ever nailed that down. I don't think I ever mastered it because I had submitted the book to my publisher of the memoir, Algonquin, which is a marvelous press, and they gave it a read and found real merit in it, but they said, we don't know quite what to do with it because it's falling between the crack of purely adult and purely juvenile or adolescent. You need to define that and clarify it because otherwise we wouldn't know how to position it or market it. So I thought, oh, okay, and I got it back and I never did that.
Yeah.
So there it sits. It was published by Itty Bitty Tiny Press, which really was the creation of my co-author on the academic books, Robert Hilliard, and it's on Amazon.com, and I've never gone back to it. I've thought about going back to it and defining it as either adult or a young adult, but I haven't gone there yet, and may never. Do that.
That's
I think
a hot
it's a
category.
powerful.
Young adult is a very,
It really is, and I think it's worth going back to, and I think actually it would make a very good screenplay. You know, so who knows? You never know.
You may
when
have
go
a
back
couple
to.
of screenplays in
Yeah,
there.
maybe. You know, better yet if they're actually produced.
Yeah, well, or an option.
Or
Options are
option.
okay
I'd go
too.
with option,
Those
too.
pay
Yeah,
every
yeah,
year.
yeah.
You know, when we were talking about screenplays, though, we had sort of an interesting digression there about. Does it go on the big screen, or is it more focused on? Can you share what you've?
There are so many outlets now. If you're, an old line guy like I am, who is a real cinemaphile, someone who adores cinema, you always think film, and moreover, you always think theatrical film, because to me that's the legitimate way to have a book end up on film. But in this day and age, there are so many other media and so many other venues for content that reach even more people and that are done beautifully and that actually turn out to be more profitable, that I have to be reminded of that when the gentleman who has The Next Better Place now and is considering putting a package together, he had to remind me that there are other places to take this that actually might end up being seen by far more people and may turn out to be far more profitable. So you have to say, well, you're the expert in that, and I certainly defer to you.
Because it's similar to. I mean, at one time I thought. Having my book come out in the hardcover, that's the only legitimate type of book, is a hardcover book.
Right.
And then you realize, well, wait a minute now, there's trade paperback, there's commercial paperback, there's e-book, there are all kinds of things.
Yeah, there's literary paperback, if you want to call it that. So there's so many. When I did The Next Better Place, of course it came out in hardcover. It was, a traditional hardcover book from a major publisher. And then they went to sell the rights to the paperback, and they weren't pleased with the offers they were getting, and so they decided they were going to do the soft cover of it versus a paperback. Paperback's more like mass market.
Yeah, mass market versus trade paperback.
But the soft cover generally costs a little bit more and whatnot. So they did the soft cover on that. Then they did sell the foreign rights to a publisher in the UK. And then they sold the rights to the audio book, which it came out as an audio book by the same fellow who did the Lance Armstrong. It's Not About the Bike. He did my memoir and did a very
So
good
you're kind of
job
a
with it.
mogul.
Yeah, right.
Think
A
about it. I
mogul
mean,
without money. How is
well,
that?
I mean,
you
now
know?
wait a minute. I'm adding up. I'm toting up all these different venues that you've had, and I feel intimidated.
Oh, don't
sitting-
do that. Don't do that. You're certainly someone who is having success with what you do in your series of books.
Yeah, no, I don't really feel too intimidated, but I thought it, I thought it was. Now, as we close, can you tell me what kind of advice would you? There are people out there who want to write or are
Yeah.
aspiring writers. What kind of advice would you give them? Because the world has changed for that.
Well, you can't be a writer unless you read. You got to read, 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 read. And then to be a writer, you have to have a passion to do it. You know, we hear, especially authors, we hear people saying, oh, you know, I'd like to write a book. I'm going to write a book. I have a good idea. I think I'll write a book. And I think, oh, that's all well and good, but there's more to it than that. You know, there's dedication, there's work, you know, you have to spend a lot of lonely time at it. And you have to learn the craft. You have to know what the heck you're doing. And moreover, it helps if you have some DNA talent, something that helps you out there. You can want to do it more than anything in the world, but I think writing is an exercise that can be learned to a certain extent, but if you don't start with, you know, with the original molecules, you're probably not going to get as far as you'd like to get. There are a lot of books out there, and there are a lot of not such good books out there, and maybe those books are from people that lack the dedication, or maybe they have the dedication, but they just don't have that quintessential seed that needs to be watered to grow.
Well, that's great advice from someone who has written 40 books.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. And we want to
whatever.
thank so much, Michael. I enjoyed meeting you and talking with you, and I actually enjoyed your short stories.
Thank you.
Even though,
I'm glad you did.
I'm just saying it's an acquired taste for me, but I encourage others to look at them and to look on the Amazon author page as well as your website,
Yeah,
which
sure,
would list
right.
all of his books. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me on your
And
show. I appreciate it.
Those students are lucky to have you as an
Well,
instructor.
I'm lucky to have them.
Yeah, really. And we are very glad that all of you tuned in. And once again, another time for us to enjoy a great author.
And can I say one thing? This book was published by Palm Art Press because my publisher would be very angry if I didn't remind them that they did a wonderful job on this.
And they did. The cover is great.
Yeah.
So Palm Art Press. Keep that in mind and look it up. Thank you so much.